Over 32 months, Russia has been waging war on Ukraine, and today we will review the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. One of the largest missile and drone attacks of the entire wartime was launched by Russia on Ukraine this morning. A total of 90 cruise missiles and 120 kamikaze drones rained down across the entire country. We are experiencing major power outages across the country, we have several deaths in different cities, and here we have footage showing us how the cruise missiles flew over the country this morning in various patterns. Unfortunately, Ukraine has hardly any means to defend itself against these weapons. We know that this happened. 16 Tupolev 95 strategic bombers were deployed, along with an additional 6 Tu-22M bombers, which were used for the purpose of launching these numerous cruise missiles at Ukraine. As mentioned, there are major disruptions in the power system and damage this morning. In this video, we can focus on the top right, which was recorded over Kiev, and here over Kiev, it seems that at least some of the cruise missiles were shot down by Ukrainian air defense. We're watching this footage, about to see explosions in the sky, and then see more rockets flying in that direction. So presumably you see anti-aircraft missiles here, perhaps of the Patriot type, or the Iris-T type, or also the S-300 type, that were just deployed here in the sky over Kiev. Now we see more explosions here. And this time we can clearly observe how these rockets, including the boosters, are visible here, along with the contrails of the various rockets, showing how they have flown there. All in all, however, another very dark day for Ukraine. Putin apparently wants to show once more that at the G20 summit, because in Rio de Janeiro, which is happening today, and following the Scholz phone call yesterday and the forthcoming inauguration of Donald Trump, he is only prepared to achieve his objectives through the use of force and aggressive actions. He intends to demonstrate that he is the one calling the shots, setting forth the terms and conditions under which Ukraine must either negotiate or eventually surrender. That's essentially nothing else he wants, and of course also with these further attacks. Bombing Ukraine into darkness and cold, now that temperatures are dropping below 0 degrees in Ukraine, aiming to force millions more to flee to Europe. But not only in the sky over Ukraine is Russia causing trouble, heavy fighting continues in the east of Ukraine, with Russians making significant territorial gains. We are examining the current situation in Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar was formerly a town that had a population of tens of thousands of residents located to the west of Bakhmut. We recall Bakhmut was seized by the Russian army in May 2023. And in Chasiv Yar, the front has remained relatively firm so far. There, the Ukrainian army has managed to be one of the few places and few locations where the Russians have not advanced further. However, now we can see Russian soldiers entrenched in the city's center. We observe how 2 Russian soldiers are hiding in a house that is, quite frankly, in ruins. They are also attempting to find some shelter there. It's then when the camera of the Ukrainian drone zooms out just before this shelter is violently attacked. And as we pull back and zoom out, we can see rather clearly that we're almost in the very center of Chasiv Yar. So here are these streets. There are already larger houses visible here. Previously, there were just single-family homes here, areas, but now also including schools and other buildings. And this shows us, as we'll see on the map in a moment, that the Russians have advanced 1,300 meters within the city and have now also reached the center here. We are now seeing another video from the Ukrainian army showing they don't accept this and continue to defend. Here we see a Ukrainian drone approaching, which is about to drop a grenade precisely into this hole over here, aiming to eliminate the Russian soldiers located there. That often works. Russians suffer heavy losses. Now we can see the throw right here with the grenade being tossed in, landing precisely in that basement window and resulting in a big explosion. Nonetheless, we are currently in a situation where in Chasiv Yar the Russians are advancing even further, seemingly having pushed the Ukrainians back almost all the way into the city's center, and that they can now only be attacked effectively from the sky. We carefully examine the map and notice that the situation in Chasiv Yar has significantly deteriorated. As mentioned, on the right is Bakhmut, a city with 75,000 under Russian control for 1.5 years. And here is Chasiv Yar, and we see this new orange advance here. This is the combat area that now, for the first time, extends into the center of the city. Previously, we only knew that the Russians were being held up at this canal, which stretches along here. Mostly they managed to get across at some points, but only by a few hundred meters, and they were successfully stopped there. But now, for the first time, Russian soldiers have been spotted in the center of Chasiv Yar, and when we also looked at the surrounding area, it did not seem as though there were Ukrainian soldiers everywhere who are preparing for the fight. We saw all these debris, and we saw that the Ukrainians used drones to attack the Russians there, which always indicates that that the Russians already maintain control on the ground there, and the Ukrainians are strategically attacking them with their drones from a distance of a few hundred meters further west. Not only in Chasiv Yar are there advances by the Russian army, but also near Selidove, a major city that was captured a few weeks ago, the Russian army is slowly advancing further, and we have footage here showing us the whole scenario. The Russian army has released these recordings. We see here a shelter, basically a trench of the Ukrainians located here, and the Russians have apparently flanked it. We see 3 Russian soldiers who just threw a grenade in here. We see this peephole. The Ukrainians seem unaware of the Russians already behind them. So you are able to see even further to the right from our viewpoint, and the Russians have just hurled a grenade from above into this bunker, which is now in the process of exploding. The whole thing, yes, always strange recordings. It kind of reminds me of the Second World War, where soldiers actually had to throw hand grenades and similar things into the enemy's trench at very close range. Apparently Russian soldiers must also do this and then have to run away very quickly before all these explode. But we also see more footage of Russians advancing here. Once again, they don't hesitate to openly show that they're advancing with Desert Cross 1003 buggies, which are essentially golf carts imported from China here. There we see it. So they continue to move along the front. These are those small, you might jokingly call them golf carts that have almost no armor, can carry about 5 to 7 soldiers. And that, we've also seen it by the hundreds, already destroyed by Ukraine. We remember last winter Russia bought about 2,100 of them in China. Each unit cost 16,000 euros, which was a bargain back then. Now we observe the Russians trying to repel a Ukrainian drone and reportedly succeeding in this effort. We see it again, the soldiers fire here, and here is where the drone is said to crash now. However, this is not as important as what we are about to see, because these recordings once again show us that the Russians have advanced, and we're referring to the small village of Hrihorivka. This is Hrihorivka, which is located around 5 kilometers west of Selidove. And that represents the furthest advance the Russians were able to make from that point. The presence of the Russians is clearly shown by these recordings. For here we have the drone footage, showing us once again these destroyed buildings in Hrihorivka. And at these buildings and also on the street that runs here, we can see that the Russians made the recordings here on the street, that the Russian soldiers are now coming out with the flag. And we can see that this district is now under Russian control and that there are no Ukrainian soldiers on the ground here anymore. The Russians are celebrating in their typical way with flags to show they are moving forward. It took weeks, maybe 1.5 months, for the 5 kilometers. There are hundreds of Russians who have died again. We have shown videos of the destroyed Russian vehicles and the dead soldiers. Nonetheless, they have successfully managed in the last 6 weeks to advance an additional 5 kilometers in the direction towards the west. Let's take a closer look at the map, and we observe that the lead in the Selidovo area is relatively contained with a distance of merely a few kilometers. Nonetheless, it does indeed continue along this railway line here. Let's take a quick closer look at that. Hrihorivka is roughly positioned here, which means this village was captured at this location, and as I just pointed out, it's approximately 5 kilometers away from the outer outskirts of Selidovo. And naturally, the primary aim here, which the Russians are likely to target during the winter season, after achieving success further south, is indeed to attack Pokrovsk from various directions. It is worth noting that the Russian advance was stopped in front of Pokrovsk several months ago. Progress is slow in that area, but they are indeed attempting to advance further forward. So this is the railway line that leads from the south to Pokrovsk, and this also seems to be the path and the route the Russians intend to continue on. We move a bit further south to the Kurakhove area, and we know that the situation there is absolutely dramatic for the Ukrainian army. Kurakhove, once home to 18,000 people, stays mainly under Ukrainian control, though flanked from both south and north. It might come to mind that we saw a video only a few days ago vividly depicting a Ukrainian tank as it opened fire on the Russian forces in the central area of Sonsivka. We saw that the Russians apparently advanced the city of Sonsivka a bit further north, had reached it for the first time, but at least we still had Ukrainian units defending there. And this video from the Ukrainian army shows us once again quite clearly that indeed Sonsivka is no longer under Ukrainian control, specifically the center, but rather that Russian army vehicles are freely maneuvering on the ground there, and the Ukrainians once again, as seen in Chasiv Yar earlier, can only attack from the air, so they can no longer organize the defense on the ground. We are now seeing the footage here once more, and perhaps you can recognize it. This is the large and significant local museum located in Sonsivka, which we had featured in the previous recordings. And here we observe a Russian vehicle, which is an unarmored off-road car in the process of being attacked by a drone. We now see the direct attack first, and now we also see the attack from another perspective. Here we have the off-road vehicle that was hit by the drone, and over here is the renowned and famous large local museum of Sonsivka. About a week ago, in this precise location, we observed the Ukrainian tank firing shots in this specific direction at the Russian forces. Now we no longer see Ukrainian tanks on the ground, only Russian off-road vehicles, and unfortunately, we have to assume once again that the Russian army has advanced further in Sonsivka and that the center of the town is under their control. Yes, once again, a significant number of Russians lose their lives as they advance. In this particular video, we can observe around 10 to 15 individuals who are killed. Of course, we need to edit or pixelate that as necessary, but we can see that the Ukrainian unit defending this region is also sharing with the world through its own recordings. Must inform you that they are retreating further and that the Russians are advancing here. Let's take a brief look at the map. We head towards Kurakhove and its surrounding area and observe that we now have solid confirmation that this location from Sonsivka, situated somewhat further northwest of Kurakhove, is now at least reported to be under the control of Russian forces in the central area. And the other recordings, those other attacks we just witnessed moments ago, were in fact from these areas here. That means the Russians are also slowly advancing southward there, and we see that it's indeed a truly massive advance. The Kurakhove front stretches over a distance of approximately 50 kilometers. I need to draw this out again. Along this whole extensive stretch, they're actively trying to push forward in the direction of Kurakhove. That means we see this large arc that the Russians are forming. We have the frontal assault on Kurakhove. It has been entered here as well, so it has also advanced into the city area for the very first time. But they're trying to flank from the north and south, and the Russians are managing that relatively well despite heavy losses. In the south here at Dalnya, they've established a foothold by now. We can see that's also dark red, now colored. That means the 33rd Brigade of the Ukrainian army was also involved there with the Leopard 2, which we saw that has destroyed up to 9 Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles as proven by video evidence. Were unable to drive the Russian forces back there. Even though they clearly had fire superiority with the use of the tanks, they simply didn't have enough men. This means the Russians were there, regarding their mechanized units, defeated, but had dismounted all their infantry, and this infantry was partially killed, but has partially gained a foothold in Dalnya and in Ukraine. It also wasn't possible to fend off this attack there. The entire situation is extremely difficult because we find ourselves with 6 additional villages in this area that now essentially must be defended in 3 separate directions, and because if everything collapses here, simply come up against a large unified Russian southern front that progresses towards Kurakhove, moving in from the south. We can see in the north they have already passed Kurakhove, so they're west of it, here in the south anyway. That means the whole thing is going to be extremely difficult, and I personally don't know any Ukrainian observer who believes that Kurakhove can be held here. Rather, they are anticipating another defeat, which, as expected, will happen gradually over the course of the coming weeks and months. Where Ukraine, interestingly enough, does not suffer a major defeat, but rather where Russia suffers a defeat, and where there are no clear or obvious territorial movements in a single direction, this is in the western part of Russian Kursk. And here we have new and detailed footage showing us just how massively Russia is losing its vehicles over there. We are now observing and witnessing attacks carried out by Ukrainian Javelin anti-tank missiles, mines laid by Ukrainians, and Ukrainian kamikaze drones, which in the recent past, what is that? About 10 days over 120 Russian vehicles destroyed. That means we have daily that about 10 to 15 added, sometimes on some days even more. And we see these are not propaganda claims, but they are evidence. These are proofs, all captured on video. And we can see how the Russians are massively driving over mines here, how they use their armored vehicles, armored terrain vehicles, which are mine-protected vehicles of the Oral type, how they really dozens of them lose in this particular scenario. Interestingly, they don't seem to have the upper hand here, so that it doesn't look like the map shows us that every day 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers of the area fall back under Russian control. But Ukrainians also initiate repeated counterattacks, as we recently observed with Bradley's and infantry forces, to reclaim the villages that the Russians had previously attacked, where they had to accept such great losses, then to recapture it as well. We see the Javelin attack again that we just discussed, and now we can see how this missile, yes, here we see it, is actually seeking out its target on its own. From here, it approaches, there's the Russian vehicle, which will be hit soon and consequently also destroyed there. On the map, we can also see once again that the Russians, despite deploying so many hundreds of vehicles and so many thousands of soldiers here, are not managing to achieve it. Completely regain control of the course. And we have here, yes, back and forth, a few localities have fallen back under Russian control. On the whole, we've indeed been experiencing this current situation here for approximately 6 weeks already now. And there's been little change. The Russian advances come from all sides. From the north, moving towards Malya Lokna, and from the western side through Lyubimovka, which was successfully retaken, as well as via Pokrovsk. That means we are seeing a truly significant Russian effort to advance further here. And to address this territory before the 20th of January, before entering any negotiations with Trump or establishing conditions with the USA to realistically attempt to freeze the conflict, the whole thing is supposed to be brought back under Russian control. However, we see that the Russians are deploying very good units here, namely the 810th Marine Brigade, particularly meant to achieve this with modern infantry vehicles like the BTR-82A, but also the Ukrainians have very good quality units strategically here to effectively use many weapons obtained from their Western allies with the clear goal of truly holding Kursk securely for as long as possible and to entice more and more Russian soldiers into this trap. And we mustn't forget each of the over 100 Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers destroyed or damaged in Kursk can't invade Ukraine. In that regard, from this viewpoint, the Ukrainian strategy in Kursk can indeed be comprehended and understood. We want to look at two more recordings. One is already 2 days old. Nonetheless, it is very impressive. It shows the night sky over Odessa. As we are all aware, Odessa is a major port city located in Ukraine on the coast of the Black Sea. Russia frequently endeavors to advance by using the Geran 1 and Geran 2 drones, which were previously called Shahid 136 and Shahid 131 from Iran, in order to fly over the city because they have to pass through this particular area before moving to invade Ukraine so they can attack cities much deeper inland. And now let's see what kind of anti-aircraft fire these drones encounter. These are not computer-simulated images. This is an actual night recording from Ukraine, where you can see that a wide range of calibers, a wide range of guns, all rapid-fire rifles from Gepard to ZSU 23-2. To Browning machine guns, everything imaginable is being used to intercept these drones during their approach or flight over Odessa. We also frequently observe those spotlights being directed into the sky over there. And in that sense, one tries here, perhaps as known from the Second World War, such recordings, attempts with massive anti-aircraft fire. Without using rockets, but primarily with rapid-fire guns, they are threatening to shoot down the Geran 1 and Geran 2 here. The footage is striking, and it's crucial to remember that hundreds of thousands still live in Odessa. So that's pure horror for the civilian population there when these explosions, these shots are heard at night. Nevertheless, the whole thing is certainly something Russia does deliberately to terrorize the population there. When we talk about air defense, we also have Russian air defense in Ukraine, of course. And here we see once again that one of these systems is being destroyed, and in a manner that we've seen many times, yet always makes you shake your head a bit about how the Russians camouflage their systems. We have a Buk M1 system here, and it's relatively easy to identify because there are 3 missiles positioned side by side, each with these distinct white warheads at the front. And now we're looking at some Ukrainian footage. With a trained eye, you can see how they spot a Buk M1 system in the forest, something the Ukrainians do every day. It's situated around here, and if we look closely, we can see these 3 white rocket heads. They remain pointed forward in the system, right here, aimed steadily in the launch direction, showing their readiness for action. That means the Russians have set up anti-aircraft defenses within Ukraine to shoot down Ukrainian aircraft, or something similar, like drones. The Ukrainians discovered it, spotted this system, and are attacking it at night with a drone, targeting precisely these missiles we just saw. Here we see it again from another perspective, namely drop grenades on it. Here we can see the complete system down here once more. And on top of that, the 3 rockets lying here. Exactly on one of these rockets we're throwing now. Sorry, here we can see it even better. Here we see it better again. So there are truly 1, 2, 3 rockets lying right there. That's exactly where the drone now drops its grenade, and one of these grenades apparently penetrates the rocket casing. And we then witness an absolute inferno breaking out because the rocket fuel is exploding here. We see incredible power. These rockets are supposed to reach 10 kilometers high, launched into the air against the pull of gravity. When the fuel gets struck, it is extremely flammable, leading predictably to a significant and immediate explosion. That means another 10 million euro Russian system was destroyed here by a perhaps 1,000 euro drone with a 50 euro grenade from the Ukrainians. All this is happening, importantly, in parallel to what we see on the ground, both in Kursk and in the east of Ukraine, as well as in Ukrainian airspace, where Russia is doing everything to ensure that by winter, as the cold season brings temperatures to -20 degrees, typical for Ukraine's winters, prompting more millions to flee west, and thus, as the Kremlin hopes, causing the country to collapse further.